everybody and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about delivering an inclusive microfunding approach. It's part of, so it's going to be based on our report and our findings called Changing a Place, Microfunding, Co-Production and Community Development as part of the Ageing Better Festival of Co-Production. Okay, so first of all I'll tell you a little bit about Ambition for Ageing and who we are, and then we'll go into the workshop. So Ambition for Ageing is a Greater Manchester-wide cross-sector partnership. We're aimed at creating more age-friendly places and empowering people to live fulfilling lives as they age. We're funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. My name is Kirsty. I work for the Central Ambition for Ageing team based at Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisation, GMCVO, as you can see in the corner of the presentation. I'm joined today by Lucy North from the same team as me, and Steve Sherry, who was involved in Ambition for Ageing in Bolton in a whole host of roles, including making decisions about microfunding as a volunteer. Today we'll be sharing how you can use a pot of money to fund community activity, and particularly with a focus on how to include service users in design and delivery of the funding programme and make the model as inclusive as possible. So in January 2020, we published our report on our experiences of microfunding across the past 5 years. We will share a link to that at the end, and there's a full report, a 4-page briefing and some technical guidance, and yeah, we'll share the link to that. So, Ambition for Ageing, as I said, was led by GMCVO. It was initially a 5-year programme that was delivered in 25 neighbourhoods across 8 local authorities in Greater Manchester. Across these wards, there were 21,000 older people involved in the design and the delivery of small projects. Ambition for Ageing's belief is a series of small changes within our communities will bring large-scale success in a practical and sustainable sense, and that will ultimately help to reduce social isolation. Our vision is to connect communities and people through the creation of relationships, and putting older people at the heart of making those decisions about designing the places they live. Through doing that, the programme facilitates the development of existing assets within communities to allow older people to direct investments, so using asset-based approaches. And I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
Thanks, Kirsty. So my name is Lucy North. I'm the Communications Assistant on Ambition for Ageing and co-author of the Microfunding report. So what is microfunding? Microfunding is the provision of small amounts of funding to individuals, groups or organisations. On Ambition for Ageing, we provided microfunding in the form of small investments of up to £2,000 to individuals or groups who were able to propose a project or idea that could improve the lives of people aged over 50. So the way it worked is that local steering groups of older people and delivery staff in each ward of Greater Manchester made decisions on where money was invested. In Bolton, for example, which Steve will speak more about later, a partnership between Bolton CPS, AGK Bolton and Bolton at Home supported the microfunding model. And between 2015 and 2020, we invested over £2 million via our microfunding model. Next slide, please. So there are 5 main features of the Ambition for Ageing microfunding approach. The first being co-production. Older people were involved in the design and the delivery of all projects and were involved in deciding which projects received funding. Secondly, intensive support from local delivery staff. So with co-production being such a key part of the model, support from staff was absolutely key to provide guidance and oversight, especially when it came to the decision-making groups. Community development and capacity building was especially important in terms of engaging with and involving more marginalised people and groups. In each local area where microfunding was delivered, there was a supported application process, meaning the funding was available to smaller and unconstituted groups. There were also networking opportunities for investees to encourage the growth of their networks. A test and learn approach. So local delivery leads were permitted to change and develop their microfunding structures and processes to tailor the approach to their local area. And finally, an open funding criteria. Projects were funded based on the expressed wishes of older people who decided where investments should be made. Older volunteers conducted community investigations and asset mapping activities to identify gaps and priorities in the local area. This open funding criteria alongside the test and learn approach meant that the local delivery leads could fund what the local area needed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the type of projects that were funded, the 5 most common themes were social action, physical space, outdoor space, skills and employment, and adaptations to physical space. Among other things, these themes reflected the importance of a need for accessible community spaces and social infrastructure within neighbourhoods. And we found that that's something that's come up again and again throughout the programme, is the sort of importance of social infrastructure. So I'll quickly just talk about the findings from the report. So the report found that a small pot of money can generate real change within neighbourhoods. We found that the flexibility of the model meant that a wider variety of groups and organisations were able to apply because the application process was simple and inclusive. The variety of ways available to engage with the process meant that barriers to applying were reduced. Since we wrote the report on microfunding, Ambition for Ageing was awarded extension funding from the National Lottery Community Fund until the end of March 2022. And part of this work has been using what we learned about microfunding in the first 5 years of the programme to continue a programme of small investments. So in autumn and winter 2020, we awarded £5,000 to each of the 10 local areas of Greater Manchester to fund a small number of projects. There's a full list on our website. I'll add the link in chat shortly. But next month, we'll be launching a much larger programme with £20,000 for specific neighbourhoods in the local areas. The learning from our past work in the report has been invaluable, both in terms of designing a process for the microfunding model and being able to understand the impact that small investments can have. So now I'll hand over to Steve, who's going to speak about the microfunding model in Bolton.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Sherry. I was involved with Ambition for Ageing in Bolton. I took on many roles within Ambition for Ageing in Bolton, but that was mainly involved in the monthly or fortnightly group meetings, and also on the investment panel. Ambition for Ageing in Bolton was delivered by Bolton CVS, Age UK Bolton, and Bolton at Home, and it concentrated on 3 particular wards in and around Bolton, which were Halliwell, Crompton and Tongue-with-the-Hoff, which were areas that were identified that needed extra help and support from the Ambition for Ageing programme. Have the next slide, Kirsty, please. Right, this is basically the process that people went through to gain the microfunding from Ambition for Ageing. So volunteers and staff supported community members to develop their ideas into applications. So basically groups would come to us and tell us exactly what it is they wanted the money for, and we would actually help and support them in putting in an application directly to Ambition for Ageing. Applications could be done in 2 different ways. It could either be done in an application form, or it could be done as with the investment panel or the spending roadshow. If they went for the investment panel, they would fill out an application form as you do for any application for funding. And then this would be put forward to the advisory group, and then a panel of us, which usually is between about 6 and 8 people. We would look at the individual applications and decide whether these applications would go forward or not. The spending roadshow was slightly different in that people at various venues in the 3 particular wards would have the opportunity to go up and actually pitch for their funding. This was good in 2 ways. Number one, it actually got the information out that those particular groups actually existed within that particular area, because I went to a few road shows with Yasmin, who used to facilitate Ambition for Ageing, and we were amazed at the amount of groups that were going on within each borough that other people within the borough didn't know anything about. So not only did it give the people an opportunity and the confidence to get up in front of a crowd of people and actually pitch for the funding, it actually got the word out about the particular groups and what they were actually doing. Either way, whether it was a written application or whether it was the spending roadshow, there was always support and advice given through CVS and Ambition for Ageing. Investment support provided to investments through CVS to increase sustainability. Projects may evolve and apply for further funding where relevant. So what we looked at projects going forward. We also looked to see whether they were sustainable, i.e. could they sustain themselves at the end of the investment without actually having to apply for more funding. That was one of the keys for us, because we knew that Ambition for Ageing wasn't going to be ongoing. So we needed to make sure that if these programs or events were set up, that they were sustainable once Ambition for Ageing was gone, basically. So the road shows I found particularly useful. I thought they were just a brilliant idea of not only people pitching for their ideas, but bringing the community together in different areas, and different people who wouldn't normally have met each other, getting to meet each other. The panel met about for funding, I would say probably every 4 to 6 weeks. The format of it was quite casual, so we would know it was between 6 and 8 of us. We would be given 2 or 3 applications. We would go through these applications and again look for sustainability, look through the applications to make sure what they're applying for met the actual criteria, and then look at the costings to make sure that it was actually viable for them, for the amount of money that they're actually applying for. The final say on who got the investment was actually the panel. The only time when we wouldn't decide on who got the funding would be if we wanted further clarification, because sometimes the application, brilliant applications, but we wanted clarification on a few different issues, or clarification on costings that they've actually put forward to us. That's basically how the panel worked, i.e. the road shows or the investment panel, where they did the applications as you normally would do via a paper or online application. Could I have the next slide, please, Kirsty? So these are people who have got, well, we can't see what they've got, can we? But anyway, these are people who've been successful and they've got the money from Ambition for Ageing and get on and do the actual project. During the project and at the end of the project, we would always have a look, unless it was an ongoing project, we would always have a look and check up on them to make sure how the project was going and whether it was being effective, and how many people were engaging with each individual project. And I have to say, during the 2.5 years that I was involved with the investment panel, some of the work that we saw being done through very small investment from Ambition for Ageing were absolutely outstanding. We were shocked and taken back by how much they managed to do with such a small amount of money, which just goes to show that a lot of groups and organisations, that's what they need, just that little bit of support financially, and they can basically work wonders. How did I get involved? I was asked, because I sit on many groups and panels at CVS in Bolton, so I was asked to join Ambition for Ageing, and also through the work I do, I run an LBGT group in Bolton, which has also had, I've also put applications in for, to Ambition for Ageing, only 2 applications, but we were successful on them both. Obviously, I couldn't sit on the panel for those two applications. They were both actually for, we run a weekly drop-in group, but we also run a monthly night within the central Bolton, so an LBGT night, and every Christmas we put on entertainment, we put on food, and we make sure that everybody's got a Santa hat and everybody's got a little gift. So we put in 2 applications for that, and we were successful on them both. I myself, I'm a carer. I'm not quite a full-time, but it can be full-time for my dad, who's got a number of underlying health problems. I found that being a volunteer, particularly with Ambition for Ageing, I could actually dip in and dip out of it with no problems at all. Obviously, you can't do that as if you're a paid employee, but I was able to do that with Ambition for Ageing. But I tended to find that even as a carer, unless my dad was particularly bad, I could actually get out to most of the Ambition for Ageing either funding panels or just the general meeting. I found being on Ambition for Ageing very rewarding. I found that the expertise within the group and the skill sets within the group have been absolutely amazing. I'm still in contact with most of the people that were on the Ambition for Ageing panel in Bolton, and we're looking through Age UK to set up or continue a similar panel. But we're in talks with Age UK and Bolton to do that. But I found it a very fulfilling and very rewarding sort of experience being on Ambition for Ageing. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. I think one thing to note is that each of the different areas, so Bolton is one, we have Wigan, Oldham, Manchester, etc., 8 of the local authorities within Greater Manchester, each one had a different process. So that chart that you saw that Steve went through was Bolton's, and that was one of the strengths of the programme, as Lucy mentioned, that flexibility. So each of those processes was not only developed to meet the needs of that area, but then also changed as well and adapted to be able to meet the needs of people as they were implemented and started going through. That actually, if things didn't work well, or if they found they were missing certain groups, that they could actually be adapted. So I was going to go through that a little bit. Also to note that we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions throughout, you can add them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end, or you can wait until the end to ask them, up to you. So I'm going to go through some examples and to changes to processes and additional resources as well. So Steve mentioned that Bolton ran community roadshows, and I know a few of you in the chat have been talking about those, and that was really an important part of many of, I think all of the different models for microfunding that we ran, and that was offering those alternative approaches that didn't involve a formal board process. In Manchester and Oldham, they held participatory budgeting events, sort of slightly different to a roadshow, but a similar idea. And you know, for those who don't know what participatory budgeting is, you have presentations given by attendees, and then people within the room vote on who received the funding. It's a bit more informal, as Steve said as well. It then lets people know about what events are in the area, and avoids that whole formal process of filling out a form while still getting all the information you need to do your proper checks and balances. So running targeted work for specific communities. So one of our early pieces of work on Ambition for Ageing found that asset-based approaches can, if you don't use them with an understanding of inequality and marginalisation, can exacerbate existing inequalities, because often the first people to come forward are those with power or with already have the resources within their neighbourhood. So one of the things that the Ambition for Ageing local programmes did was run targeted work for specific communities. So it often formed part of their wider community development and research. Tameside, for example, runs specific targeted projects around people with dementia and BAME communities, specifically relevant to their area, to make sure that those getting involved, that everybody was able to get involved in the process. Changing the focus of funding decisions. So this is about understanding your area really well. So for example, in some of the more affluent wards, the emphasis was more on facilitating things to bring the community together and doing the community development work. Whereas in areas of high deprivation and a sense of decline, more capacity building work was needed, and particularly to engage parts of the community that may have felt disenfranchised, or kind of to overcome feelings of distrust, maybe resulting from high levels of crime and antisocial behaviour, or where pots of funding had been provided previously and then funding had run out and people have had to leave. And As a result, funding decisions in those areas tended to be more focused on value for money, whereas funding decisions in affluent areas meant staff were required to encourage volunteers to maybe think more holistically when assessing applications. Offering personalised practical help. So Steve mentioned a little bit about this. So many of the processes were designed to offer personal support throughout. For example, in Bury, the process started with the person having an idea. So that was the very beginning. Rather than anything project-based, it was, do you have an idea? They were then invited to a project workshop where they had a chance to talk about the idea, offered support to put it into an action plan before then going to the application process and the decision-making board. Similarly, in Salford, anybody with an idea could speak to staff, get support to complete the application form before it went to a panel. The softer approach meant that people didn't have to feel like they had to be an expert in order to start the process. For some people, and other support, such as for some people, maybe as simple as getting to the venue or, needing to arrange a lift to get somewhere, telephone call reminders, as well as emotional support, because as much as, either standing up and presenting at a event or even filling an application form, you may need some emotional support, some confidence building and encouragement. So access to involvement. There are access issues that always need to be considered in community development work, such as physical access to buildings, digital access, so particularly the last year, access to Zoom, and not only kind of here's an iPad, but here's how you use it. Timings of meetings for carers or to meet religious needs, for example, during Ramadan, making sure that if the events run over lunchtime or if there's, maybe if you want to provide prayer rooms. There's also the need to be aware of other volunteers and what's called affinity bias, where people like to be around people they perceive to be the same as themselves, which can lead to marginalisation and to inadvertently excluding people who don't appear by the people maybe on a panel that would be similar to them. So that could potentially be training on equalities for volunteers, being proactive about who you invite to take part, and also having difficult conversations as well. So that goes into that final point around training and representing for panel members. I just want to mention before I go on to that, the access to involvement. We've got a really interesting story about one of our rural areas where there was the top of the hill and the bottom of the hill, and people didn't like walking up or down that hill. So the group, I think it was in Bury, they ran the sessions either on the top of the hill and then ran them on the bottom of the hill as well, because they knew they would get a completely different group of people. And you need to know your local area in order to know that that may be an issue and in order to put those processes into place. So at the beginning of the programme, one of our panels received an application for funding from a local LGBT group. And during discussion of the application, some volunteer members were concerned around the acceptability of funding a project targeting a particular community, raising concerns that it could be seen as discriminatory against non-LGBT people. And during that time, a frank discussion then would take place amongst the members and with staff input, covering topics such as inclusion, people's experiences of discrimination. And as a result of the discussions, the LGBT group received the funding. They requested, panel members took part in training to help them better gain understanding of the impact of inequalities to help form their decisions in the future. And these kind of conversations need to take place to make sure that these processes are inclusive. And it goes beyond just providing training to having conversations for panel members to ensuring that the processes are inclusive enough to include marginalised people in those decision-making positions. And that's a very complex thing to tackle. So we are now going to go into the breakout rooms to have an activity with a bit of discussion. So we're going to use, here are the questions. So we're going to give you 2 example personas based on real life examples from Ambition for Ageing, obviously anonymised and changed a little bit. And we want to know from you what barriers the people that we've put together may face to getting involved in microfunding and for bidding, and then also how might you support them to engaging with your microfunding model and sitting on panels, etc. We've got 15 minutes for this, probably slightly less than 15 to be able to finish at 1:45, maybe 10 minutes. If you find you finished early, you can discuss the other persona. What we're going to do is we're going to ask one member of each group to make notes in a Google Doc. I'll paste that in the chat now. So what you need to do, oh, there we go. Thank you, Lucy. So when you click on that link, it takes you through to a document. You just need to click on the breakout room number you are in, and then click on the link that appears there. Only one member really need do that to take notes. You can choose to, that member can choose to share their screen in the breakout room if you're feeling a bit tech savvy. If not, then one person can just take the notes within the Google Doc. We can see that real time, so if we notice anybody struggling, we'll come into your break room and help out. We've got a couple of minutes left of this part of the session, and then we take kind of a 5-minute break, and then people can stick around for questions or conversation if they want to. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the comments that people had. And all 3 groups looked at Maisha. A lot of you talked about language and communication needs, such as support to filling in the form, but also where do they get that information about how to get the funding to begin with, potential lacks of confidence, to be able to engage in the process, more practical things, so equipment barriers, what do we wear, do we have appropriate footwear, how do we get to the place, where do we walk, toilet stops during the walk, so kind of the physical environment and how that might prohibit easy access to it, and whether there are bilingual skills to lead the group, maybe needing different walking skills, so kind of how do we run this. And a few of you pointed out the perceived fear of what you need to be a leader. So, you know, who actually is responsible for getting that funding and holding that funding? If you're going to be a leader, do you need first aid training, health and safety, and all of that as well? There's a lot more that you've all put. What we'll do is we'll pull it all together, and I'll speak to the organisers to send it through with the presentation. And moving on to the second part about how you'd engage to support them in microfunding model. Somebody's just said go to Bolton CVS, which is great. And there was also discussion around kind of, you know, doing a roadshow, maybe having physical meetings instead of online, making sure that there's respectfulness in communication and making yourself available for conversation. Utilising enablers, so community development workers and people who maybe have links already within the community, as well as helping with the application, explain technical terms. Once again, another point around the CVSs, and also just in the process itself, so ensuring plain language in the process and making sure that the availability of funding is available in the places that people go to in community venues, and explaining risk as well, and opportunity to speak to other groups who've already received funding. So there was a lot of discussion from yourselves on that. Thank you so much, and some great points brought up as well. I'm now going to hand over to Lucy to do the little sum up. Yes, Lucy.
Thanks, Kirsty. So the report is available on our website. Kirsty will post a link in chat now, hopefully. We have 3 documents available: the full report, the summary briefing, which is 4-page, sums up everything in the report nice and compactly. And we also produced a 28-page technical guidance, mostly for practitioners and funders, and it provides practical guidance to delivering your own local microfunding model. So that's a really great document. Yeah, that's me.
So yeah, we've been Kirsty, Lucy and Steve. Just before we take a short break before we enter the discussion part of the session, people are also free to leave during that if you don't have any questions or you don't want to join that bit. Just want to give a shout out to the rest of the festival. And so obviously this is part of a larger festival of co-production, and there's a huge amount of stuff coming up. We're also, as part of the Ageing Better partnership, which we're part of, there's going to be a launch of the National Toolkit. I think the first one has already happened, but the rest are on the screen now. And so this is a lot of stuff to look forward to during the rest of the festival. And I will put a link in the chat for where you can sign up to all the many different online events to take part as that. We will now give you a short 5-minute break to just have a bit of a stretch, and then we will come back for questions. Okay, hello everybody. So Steve, you might be doing some of the heavy lifting here because most of the questions seem to be for you. However, we will, that's only in the chat. We will be opening up to people just to ask questions as well. So the first question I asked right at the beginning was, did you find that the pitching took much longer than reviewing paper applications? I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer that, Steve, because I know that you weren't as involved in the admin side of things. Obviously, we don't have anybody here that was involved in that. But how did you find timings wise between pitching and then the panels?
The panels was the panel meetings were far more constructive. So we knew that when we went into a funding panel, it was basically tea, coffee, introductions, and an hour to do the paper applications, whereas the roadshows were far more informal, and that usually was either a whole morning or a whole afternoon, because you're not dealing with a static piece of paper in front of you. You're dealing with people, nervous people. Sometimes you have to get up there and basically pitch for the group. So that could have been a 2-minute presentation. It could have been an 8 or 9-minute presentation. So they were very different. I mean, I've answered a question in the chat, basically saying, from my point of view, I much preferred the road shows because you got to meet the actual people who were applying for the funding and the different people within the communities that it was going to benefit. So that's my perspective on that.
So within the road shows, so somebody's asked about the difference between road shows and participatory budgeting type events. On the road shows, were you part of a panel that made the decision as part of the road show, or was it just the same as a participatory budgeting?
No. What actually happened at the road shows is everybody would pitch. It was usually between about 5 and 7. Sometimes it went up to 10, and then what would happen is we would then give out sort of marking sheets to the people attending, and it was actually that audience there who actually voted on the application. So it was basically pick 3 out of, say, the 7 to go forward for the funding. We would then get that back and go through it all, and then basically announce, or Yasmin would announce who had actually been successful on the funding. So it was it basically opened it up so that rather than just the panel, it was actually the community themselves who were going to be involved in these projects got to actually vote on them, which I thought was fantastic.
So the answer to that is actually there's no difference between the two. I've just made a fake difference between the two. And you mentioned in the chat when somebody was asking about different demographics that the road shows, you had a lot more people from ethnic minority backgrounds taking part in those. I don't know if you want to expand on that or if that's just the answer.
Yeah, we talked about, before we did the panel, we talked about were we just going to do a paper panel, and Yasmin then, as I said, came up with the idea of doing the roadshow. So we thought the roadshows were a pretty good idea, a mixture of both. Some people are happier presenting, some people are happier just doing it on a computer screen or paper. But when we actually went to the roadshows, I think I went to 3 in total. It was predominantly people from an ethnic background that actually went for the road shows. And after the first one, where I just met some just wonderful people doing fantastic work in the communities, and getting to know these other groups and organisations who I'd seen on pieces of paper and heard about but never actually met. And the other biggie about the road shows is that when you had it and it was people from an ethnic background, they tended to put food on, and my God, what fantastic food that was. So that was always a bonus of going to the road shows. But yes, people from an ethnic background, they felt happier presenting within their own community and to their own people than actually putting an application in paper or online, which, yeah, I mean, personally, myself, I said to Yasmin, I much preferred doing the road shows to doing the actual panels within the room, because you got to meet the people that were impacted by it.
And it shows how those different approaches met the needs of different people and helped with that. And it's a question for, I guess, myself or Lucy, as Lucy co-authored the report, but I can't answer it. Does the Ambition for Ageing report touch on the approach taken by all localities? Yes. Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between the report and the technical guidance, or the? It's up to you, Lucy.
I'll talk about the report a little, and you wrote the technical guidance, so you do that one. But yeah, the report, it covers sort of all the models broadly, and then it does break them down into the differences. And in the presentation, if you remember, we had I don't know what to call it, the sort of the graphic of the different parts of the Bolton model. There's one of those for each of the different ones within the report. It's in the appendices at the very back. So yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. It's interesting, and you can very clearly see the differences between them, and yeah, great.
And from the report, which is obviously kind of, it goes through a lot more about how they worked and what changed and all that. We've then pulled together the technical guidance, which is a lot smaller, which is a page per area. So on the left-hand side of it, it's got the model, and then on the right-hand side, it has kind of the benefits of using that particular model, and some challenges that maybe came up, as well as changes that were made. So yeah, all that information's in there. Does anybody have any questions that? Is there a way of extending to Africa, particularly Zambia? I don't know. we work in Greater Manchester. However, it would be great, to promote, the findings of the report, and we think that it was a really good way of working. So if anybody can help, sharing those models with anybody anywhere who are thinking about doing this kind of model, then that would be brilliant. It would be quite a legacy if there was something set up in Zambia that was based on the Greater Manchester model. Question around promotion and how did that work? It differed from area to area. I think it's probably more in the report, because we're the central team and the people who did the actual promotion were at that local level. I'm not sure I can answer that well. However, a key part of the approach was community development. So it wasn't just about, stick a poster somewhere or put something on social media and that's it. It was very much about continual identification of who's missing from the conversation, who needs to be taking part in the conversation. So you're thinking something about mental health in localities. Can you I will call you into, yes. Then.
Sorry, I've just been having my 11s, which is why the camera's been off. I'm sure you wouldn't want to watch me eating my toast. Yeah, so we're thinking of, well, we're not thinking, we're actually starting to move to a more locality-focused way of working. And what we've, the organisation that I work for is a mental health organisation in Bolton. And what we're aiming to do is to work in the 9 Bolton localities. For those of you that are in Bolton, like Shabine and Steve will know all about it, I'm sure. But how do we promote the thing in, say, West Horton, which is one of the areas? And typically, the demographic profile of West Horton is predominantly white, but in other areas of the town, in other areas of Bolton, the proportions are almost exactly the opposite, where you get a very high level of ethnic communities. And the other thing I'm wondering about is about promoting something about mental health. From years of experience, I'm well aware that start talking about mental health and people head for the hills in a general sense. So I'm just curious, because it's something that I have agreed that we will do within our organisation. And once you've agreed it, you almost can't say, well, it's a bit hard, I'm not going to do it. So I have no real ideas about how to do it yet.
I'm not sure if we have the right people in the room to answer the question, unfortunately, because I think the answer would probably come from one of the 3 hosts for Ambition for Ageing in Bolton. So Steve mentioned Yasmin a lot. She's actually moved on from her role there now. But they would
Yeah, I know.
probably know more. However, Steve, I don't know if you were involved that much in that part of it. If the answer is no, that's fine.
No.
But what we can do is we can get in touch and kind of we've got your contact details, Melvin, so we can link you in with them, and maybe you can ask them for any advice if that would help you. Sorry, I realise that isn't a particularly useful.
Just remind me who the three partners were, because I didn't write that down and I've got a brain like a goldfish. Was it CVS, Bolton at Home, and someone else?
And
AGK Bolton as well, yeah.
Okay. Has anybody who hasn't typed in the chat got a question, or shall we wrap up? I think that was hopefully you've all found that interesting. Please do, I will post the link in the chat at the bottom of the chat so that it is there for you all to click if you want to now and do some further reading. And yes, thank you very much all for attending. We hope you found it interesting and useful.